Thank you very much. First, I'd like to thank everyone who organized what is truly, at least in my experience, a remarkable conference. It is simply rare for historians, legal thinkers, and human rights advocates to be in the same room talking about the same subjects in such an artfully woven together way. So
it's still the first panel, so you don't know.
No, I'm just, the program, if nothing else works, the program's impressive. So I'd like to explore with you a Jewish constitutional moment in early 20th century America. Here I mean something like Bruce Ackerman's famous use of the phrase, a moment of constitutive politics, when the most basic questions of group identity and group interests are up for grabs and ordinary people, in this case ordinary Jews, are deeply involved in debates and battles about what constitutes and binds them together as a people, what rights they owe one another, what forms of government and structures of authority ought to prevail among them. This Jewish constitutional moment unfolded exactly a century ago and involved a titanic clash among American Jews, or more precisely among Jews in the United States, fighting over what it meant to be both Jewish and American. And here, as in other such moments, lawyers loomed large. Indeed, thanks to work like Jim Loeffler's, it's becoming familiar ground that Jewish lawyers played an outsized role in fashioning the terms of Jewish belonging and apartness in modern America. They crafted and led the major Jewish organizations. Lawyer leaders served as wordsmiths, organic intellectuals, strategists, technicians, power brokers, authority figures, and ethno-cultural heroes in a time and place when other authority figures and other markers of difference and authenticity had faded. That, at any rate, is my view. And here I'll focus on three of them, two famous Jewish lawyers, both named Lewis, one of whom Carol Fink has nicely described already, Lewis Marshall, and the other, of course, Louis Brandeis, and a forgotten lawyer named Isaac Arowitz. Each of them played a key role in this constitutional moment, crafting their respective accounts of American Jewishness out of disparate strands of Zionism, diasporic nationalism, Reform Judaism on one hand, and American constitutionalism on the other. Each used his practical and imaginative powers to instill his account of Jewishness into fellow Jews and Jewish organizations, fighting for hearts and minds, fighting for state recognition and international recognition for what he took to be the constitutional essentials of Jewishness. The battle unfolded during World War I. The catalyst was the rage and anguish brought on by the massacres and mass expulsions of Jews at the hands of the Tsar's armies. What kind of political campaign would American Jews undertake against these catastrophes? Relief work wasn't enough. Wartime pogroms dramatized that the bare right to life was insecure and would remain so. And as Carol and Marcos have evoked, the prospect of post-war treaty making stirred hopes of transforming the legal status of Jews in the Tsarist as well as the Habsburg and Ottoman empires. What actions would American Jewry take against the Tsar to strike back, to demand rights? The question, as the great Jewish historian Jonathan Frankel put it long ago, was how to save what could be saved now and gain what could be gained at the war's end, when peace treaties, new maps, new states, new constitutions were drawn up. The yearning for action among the Jewish masses in New York and elsewhere, with friends and families in harm's way, found no response from the established leadership and big organizations of either the uptown Reform Jewish elite or the downtown new immigrant working classes leaders either. Into the breach stepped a small band of unorthodox radicals with a programmatic vision and a new constitutional vocabulary that spoke directly to the question of Jewish rights in war-torn and post-war Eastern Europe and Russia, right? It was a vocabulary that had first taken shape in the 1890s and 1900s, not in the U.S., but of course in Eastern Europe and Russia. It crystallized in the Russian Revolution of 1905, when Russian Jews were first thrust onto the public political stage and had to consider just what rights Jews wanted in a new liberal Russia, which seemed briefly to be in the making. During that short-lived revolution, ordinary Jews were drawn, famously in this crowd, not so much to the bourgeois Jewish liberals, nor to the Orthodox socialists, but to the heterodox constitutional ideas of socialist Zionists and diasporic nationalists, whose platforms demanded not only Jewish emancipation, but also a new model national or group rights, group representation, various forms of semi-autonomous social and cultural group governance. The defeat of the 05-07 revolution sent thousands of Bundists, socialist Zionists, and Jewish autonomist activists, intellectuals, and advocates into exile. All right? They brought this new nationalism and its constitutional imaginary to the Lower East Side, by which I mean New York, where they encountered the fiercely anti-nationalist outlook of New York's great labor organizations and Jewish Socialist Party and press. So the newcomers founded small American branches of the Bund, of Poel Zion, along with tiny new outfits like the Jewish Socialist Agitation Bureau, and created a stir among a handful of youthful, adventuresome radicals. Then, however, the outbreak of war brought these tiny organizations and their outlandish outlook into sudden prominence. That plus the popular yearning for action on behalf of Jews abroad in harm's way. Ironically, then, the very aversion to united political action on the part of mainstream Jewish leadership enabled the young radicals, or the unorthodox radicals, not so young, to seize the occasion and raise the ideological stakes and imaginative horizons of how American Jews might respond to the crisis. Calling themselves the Jewish Congress movement, the radical upstarts proposed ousting the old Stadtlanim, the old German Reform Jewish elite, and their self-appointed American Jewish Committee, the AJC. It's confusing because there's an American Jewish Congress and American Jewish Committee, but we're used to these confusions in this room. The AJC of wealthy bankers and lawyers claiming to speak via quiet diplomacy and high-level contacts to the U.S. presidents and Congress on American Jewry's behalf. Over against this benevolent but demeaning old-world despotism, the radicals called for constituting American Jewry on a new basis as a democratic nation and people, an American Israel, with newly chosen leaders, a permanent American Jewish Congress, right, authorized to speak for American Jews and demand that the U.S. champion for Jews in post-war Russia and Eastern Europe a panoply of rights, brimming with individual but also group and national rights, minority rights, the rights which the Russian Jewish masses themselves had rallied around in 05-07, and demanding something like the same rights for Jews in America. In a word, the radicals forced into the unavoidable conversation about what was to be done for Russian Jews a deeper and more contentious debate about the nature of Jewish politics and the meaning of Jewishness in America. And part of the genius of Congress movement leaders like Trubowicz was to wed what was most foreign about their ideas, Zionism, group rights, nationality rights, a national program, to what was most American, and elected Congress as embodiment of American principles of democracy. It wasn't any wonder that Trubowicz was deft at wedding diasporic nationalism to American constitutionalism because he lived in both worlds. Right? He was a famous figure a century ago on the streets of the Lower East Side, a seasoned revolutionary in Russia at the same time as he was becoming an accomplished progressive reformer on the American scene. a brilliant attorney, economist, and statistician, but also a popular journalist and speaker, Trubowicz had an uncanny knack of grabbing hold of the central insights, idioms, and analytic tools of progressive American jurisprudence, institutional economics, political science, and sociology, while remaining at the same time deeply immersed in the international networks and debates of Jewish nationalism and Marxist internationalism. He did pioneering scholarship I won't describe, but the reason he was greeted on the streets of the Lower East Side as the professor is because every year he turned out dozens of vivid essays that contemporaries said were the Yiddish masses, or at least the mass readership of the Yiddish papers, main introductions to American law, history, government, and political economy. Trade unionists would introduce Trubowicz as the smartest Jew in New York. As the Congress movement took shape in 1915, figures like Trubowicz had the intellectual and imaginative resources then, along with the local knowledge and insight and locally earned authority and gravitas, to present the constitutional outlook and demands of Russian diasporic nationalism in a way that spoke to the experiences, feelings, and aspirations of the immigrant working class Jewish communities of America. Here in the great American Republic, Trubowicz would proclaim in Yiddish, we can no longer submit to the self-appointed body of men, our benevolent despots. And he went on to evoke, in words I won't take time to quote, the construction of an American Jewish Congress by assembling Jewry in every state and locality. And he would go on to fast forward to actually construct this electoral machinery with his statistical acumen and the money that we will see came from where. But now let's just turn to the Congress movement's principal opponents, the Aufjuden and their own constitutionalists and lawyer leaders. The American Jewish Committee was the premier organizational vehicle of the old German and Central European Reform Jewish elite, right, whose parents and grandparents had arrived in the mid-19th century. And as is well known, this small, well-integrated, well-assimilated elite greeted the mass immigration of poor Russian Jews in the 1890s and 1900s with deep sympathy and deep ambivalence. It was indeed, the AJC was born out of this reform elite's efforts to manage the crises produced by the mass migration and all the anti-Jewish feelings it stirred up. And one of the fruits of these efforts was a carefully crafted, constitutionally inflected, assimilationist account of American Jewishness. Right? The AJC's president was none other than Louis Marshall for decades, and he will serve us as the principal voice of this liberal Jewish constitutionalism, but it was crafted by many hands. One of the era's leading constitutional lawyers, Jew or non-Jew, Marshall may have won as many constitutional cases in the nation's high courts as any other advocate. He litigated chiefly on behalf of business corporations, but also for racial minorities. Wait a minute, how much time do I have? What do I got? I don't want to miss the punchline. How much time?
10 minutes.
10 minutes to go?
Yes.
All right, yeah. All right. So, his account of American Jewishness seized on the same classic liberal constitutionalism he wielded in court, right? The intensely individualistic precepts and of emphasizing equality of opportunity, freedom of contract, trade, and conscience, right? These precepts mirrored both the reform elite's social aspirations and the ideals at the heart of Reform Judaism's long-standing dream of an enlightened liberal state in which Jews would enjoy civic and legal equality. And at the heart of this outlook was a bar against class legislation, yes, which, of course, famously was wielded in the U.S. to condemn labor legislation, but was also wielded by figures like Marshall on behalf of racial minorities over against laws that classified, All right? So the struggle, to use one of Jim's elegant phrases, was to safeguard Jews' legal invisibility in the United States. And the flip side of that outlook was to safeguard Jews' public political invisibility in the United States, right? Which positioned the AJC as the ideal outfit to represent Jews but remain invisible, right? But we should be clear, not everything Marshall or his young partner Max Kohler did on behalf of Jews was quieter behind the scenes, right? They also staunchly represented the poor Russian Jews in the nation's federal courts and in the halls of Congress, right? Struggling to push back against racial classifications in the immigration law. And this same impulse and this same classic liberal, right, constitutionalism led them to advocate for other racial minorities. So, somewhat ironically, they were the first Jewish civil rights lawyers. And they were there roughly at the founding of the NAACP. And they created what became a kind of authority figure in Jewish American identity unto itself, the Jewish civil rights lawyer. Right? Not only for liberals and bourgeois like the men I worked for as a young man, but also leftists whom I also worked for a young man. This became, right, a Jewish American identity unto itself. The idea was that one could be at once at the heart of the establishment, a priest in the high temple of America's civic religion, but also an outsider in virtue of one's standing for and representing the outcast, right, the downtrodden, the strangers at the gate. Right? This was a durable American Jewish identity that, arguably has died. But in the 20th century, you're witnessing an old gray-bearded representative of it, but it is dying, let us be clear. In any event, an American Jewish identity. So meanwhile, I should say, Louis Marshall, right? It's perilous to build your moral identity on the uplift of others. And Marshall is a good case of that, because he had no hesitation to shout down and bully the people, the organic leaders, as it were, the organic intellectuals of the very racial others he was representing, i.e. the radicals on the Lower East Side, whom he saw as childish, inane, irresponsible, yes? But who, eventually, to get ahead of ourselves again, he comes to terms with in a brilliant and fruitful way, which Carol alluded to. The war breaks out. Isaac Arowitz begins declaiming about reconstituting American Jewry as a separate and democratic nation, attacking the Staatsmannschaften and their secret diplomacy, championing Jewish national rights, and enraging Louis Marshall, who, for reasons we haven't time to go into, finds this appalling on every possible level. It's the wrong vision of American Jewry. It's perilous for Jews in the United States. It leans toward Germany and against Russia, who was the Allies' ally, and so on and so on and so on. All right? And of course, the immigrant masses, meanwhile, are riveted by Arowitz and the American Jewish Congress movement's vision of a new American Israel, because they share his resentment at the AJC's heavy-handed paternalism. All of this would have gotten probably nowhere in terms of a constitutional moment or constitutive political clash, but for the fortuity that Louis Brandeis is just undergoing his conversion to Zionism and emerging as the leader of American and to some extent world Zionism at this very moment, and is at the same time becoming the first Jewish Supreme Court justice and the most famous Jew in America. Being Wall Street's most prominent progressive critic, he has no love for Louis Marshall and the AJC. He is happy to go into battle against them. And he realizes that the way to really claim the mantle as the spokesman and leader of American Jewry is not via Zionism or not Zionism alone. Just as in Russia '05, it's not Zionism that resonates, it's group rights and individual rights for the Jews of Russia and Eastern Europe. In Russia and Eastern Europe, it is the diasporic nationalism that Marcos sketched. that resonates, right? The group rights ideals that resonate. And so Brandeis sets himself up as the leader of the Congress movement as well. And suddenly this movement, improbably this movement that doesn't have the organizational heft and strategic resources to make a bid for leadership, gets Louis Brandeis and all the money, power, resources, and ruthless strategic brilliance that Brandeis can bring to the table, right? So they go into battle with the AJC and the big labor organizations whose own assimilationism leads them to, right, oppose these ideas by and large, until they realize we cannot simply ignore and oppose this project now that Brandeis and his lieutenants, characters like Felix Frankfurter, very wealthy people, are coming on board the Congress movement as well. There must, right, be a reckoning. Meanwhile, right, to come back to my American Jewish lawyers creating American Jewishness, Brandeis takes hold of this outlandish, from the American perspective, vocabulary of group rights and national rights, welds it together with, first of all, a vocabulary of group rights that's very central to American legal progressivism. Group rights and pluralism are nothing new to Louis Brandeis. Pluralism is very much at the heart of legal progressivism, and Louis Brandeis was talking group rights in the labor context, in the trade association context, in the legal theoretical context for years. And what happens in this moment is that he weds that form of political and economic and social pluralism to cultural pluralism, which he picks up from Horace Kallen, and to a constitutional vocabulary which he picks up from Russian diasporic Jewish nationalists, and makes them into a new discourse of American constitutionalism. It is pure legal fiction when Louis Brandeis declares that the American Constitution secures not only individual equality but group equality, not only individual rights but group rights, but when Brandeis says it, it becomes a cultural fact. Right? And so, right, he goes on, makes speeches in very important venues, writes pamphlets, speaks to mass meetings, in this resonant vocabulary, which is both about what American Jewry must demand for Russian and East European Jews at the war's end, but also is about American Jewry. Right? All the needlepoint detail I will leave out, and like Marcos, I will hasten to my conclusion. Okay. So Brandeis delivers a withering critique of classic liberal constitutionalism. He says, right, it is in some ways a familiar one to students of Zionism and Jewish nationalism, but it is quite startling in the American context, saying that liberalism is a failure. Right? Liberalism denies to Jews the ground on which to have the dignity to be Jews, the right to their differences and peculiarities, he says. So he's channeling the angst of the new Jewish immigrants, both the intelligentsia and the working classes, that they're being told to assimilate both by their own Reform Jewish leaders and by the presidents and the whole state apparatus, local and national, and their own Reform Jewish leaders, paternalists, are all saying you must, in some ways, you should remain Jewish and you should be political, but goddamn, don't be Jewish political. Don't be publicly Jewish. And Brandeis is saying this is all good. It makes you a better American to be a public political Jew. Okay. Group rights at many different levels. Now, what's different is that Brandeis and the Reform Jews have in common this kind of Jewish exceptionalism. The Auerwitz and the sort of socialist nationalists say Jews are a nation like any other nation. Brandeis and Marshall both say Jews are always already proto-Americans. Jews are like wasps. Right? Jews they're better. Yes, the Zionist Puritan pioneers in Palestine are better. is a great theme. It's also in Zangwill's Melting Pot. We are the true WASPs, the true Puritan pioneers, right? And we are settling in the wilderness of Palestine, and we are fighting the Indians. Who are the Indians? The Arabs. All right, so now I'll get to my conclusion. So 2 takeaway points, right? One of them is, I don't find it, but I'll tell it what it is. The story is usually told by Jewish historians as though group rights really didn't work in the American context. This is what this is what the socialists, said to the diasporic nationalists. That is a Russian solution for a Russian problem. Get over it. What on earth do you mean, my dear, by a national program? We have all the rights we need here. And historians, by and large, have agreed that group rights, the national idea, was kind of something, a kind of intellectual baggage that needed to be put away. I think that's wrong. I think conceptually, organizationally, and emotionally, at every level, group rights were an indispensable part of fashioning what proved a durable language and grammar and narrative of Jewish belonging and apartness. Brandeis was right. Auerwitz was right. Conceptually, right, as professional rememberers, we should reconstruct better the role of group rights on the American scene. And as legal thinkers, the simple fact that group rights as a phrase never gets enshrined in American constitutional and legal discourse is very different from saying group rights do not necessarily, right, inextricably play a part in the construction of American pluralism. Even someone as sophisticated and as much an unimpeachable pluralist as Michael Walzer is wrong about this as well. Group rights are an indispensable, inescapable part of constructing any kind of pluralism, liberal, corporatist, what have you. There has to be some set of legal ideas and concepts doing that work. We can talk more about it in the Q&A. And certainly in terms of transforming the structures of feeling of American Jewry and giving a new identity, so that the upshot of the constitutional moment is that for better and worse, the ethno-racial, pluralist, public political, nationalist version of Jewishness doesn't completely destroy. Jim's writing a wonderful book, or has finished a wonderful book about the continuing battle. But suddenly their hegemony is challenged, and they have to make space for this set of interlocutors and this alternative. And finally, this takes us back to Marcos's paper. Brandeis, at the very moment he's doing all this creative higher lawmaking, this imaginative higher lawmaking about group rights in the American scene, is also imagining a constitution for the Jewish state. And it is as though he's rehearsing Marcos's story, because just as he's saying group rights is indispensable, individual rights, classical liberalism by themselves, doesn't leave a space for human dignity and freedom. He's imagining a Jewish state which precisely has when it comes to Palestine's Arabs, has no group rights. We will guarantee the civic and political equality of all the inhabitants of Palestine. So his noble vision and his insights only went so far. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all 3 speakers.